consulting. Mike lives in Bristol and he has 15 years experience in the charity sector as a fundraiser, consultant, senior manager and trustee. He set up Lime Green Consultancy in 2014 and has worked with hundreds of organisations in that time. Ethical fundraising is one of his specialties, and he has delivered similar sessions to this one that we're going to have now. And he also facilitates in-house ethical fundraising workshops. So thanks for joining us, Mike. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone. Great to see you all with sunshiny backgrounds where you've got your cameras on and a few familiar faces as well. I will pop up my slides, just waiting for those to show up now, and I've put my contact details on there as well, and a link to our mailing list for anyone that wants to get in touch at the end as well. But just to tell you a little bit about my work and kind of how it crosses over with ethical fundraising. So I set up Lime Green Consulting in, I think it was 2014, and we work with quite a broad range of charities and social enterprises, particularly sort of small and medium organisations across the three areas you see on screen. So we do quite a lot of broader strategic planning and facilitation work with management teams and boards of trustees. We help organisations to develop and review fundraising strategy, and our wider team do kind of bid writing and trust and foundation setup work as well. And I think what's interesting, the reason why I wanted to mention this is kind of ethical fundraising over the years cuts across a lot of these areas. It's quite fundamental to a lot of the strategic planning you'll do, but then you see the very kind of frontline impact of it when researching funding prospects and writing applications as well, in terms of suddenly coming across funders where there'll be that moment where someone expresses that concern around what is the source of that funding, and should we consider that carefully in terms of whether we accept or reject or approach that funder or not. So what I'm going to cover today, kind of two parts to this talk. Firstly, looking at the problem, really. So I'm going to start with a couple of the real higher profile examples of problematic philanthropy. One obviously very topical to Bristol in relation to Edward Colston, and also the case of the Sackler Trust. But for me, I think where it then gets interesting is we all have those examples that we've probably heard of before and understand to be problematic, but then there are a kind of vast region of grey areas below that I think can often make you stop and think twice around, if we say we don't want to accept this type of donation, should we also be thinking carefully about this one, and what implications does that have for other areas of our fundraising? Because I've got a personal interest in this topic, I've then kind of gone on and read quite a few books that map out more of the kind of academic case against philanthropy. So I wanted to share a few thoughts that come out of sort of various high profile authors and thought leaders around, what are some of the big picture issues with philanthropy that we need to be thinking about. I'm then going to share a couple of examples of one charity that accepted a very contentious donation and how they handled that, and then one that rejected one, and again, what was the fallout from that, and then really to bring it all together to say, well, what does that mean for you, your organization and your leadership team? So what are some of the key dilemmas you need to wrestle with? And then part two is hopefully starting to sketch out some of the answers to those troublesome questions I'm going to pose. So really starting to look at how do we develop a more ethical approach to fundraising in our organizations. So firstly, what criteria should you and shouldn't you use when making difficult decisions? And then how do you build that into a formalized ethical fundraising policy? And for me, I think the bit that people often don't do is then thinking ahead to how you justify and stand behind those decisions when they're contentious. So something I've seen organizations do quite a lot is initially feel happy to accept a donation, and then they attract quite a lot of criticism and fallout that maybe they hadn't anticipated and thought about ahead of time, and they row back on that decision and they reject it, and they kind of end up in this position where they've got neither the money nor the credit as a result. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a way to think about what criticism you might attract for some of the decisions you make, and how to kind of prepare for that so you can make sure your decisions are more robust and something you can stand behind. And then something I find myself saying quite a lot with any of our strategy work, any strategy or policy, it's very easy for it only to be a piece of paper that sits gathering dust somewhere in a drawer or in a shared folder or something like that. So what can you actually do to make sure your policy is more than that, and it's something that your organization can kind of live and and breathe. So that's the plan for the next sort of 35 or 40 minutes. I know we then get lots of really interesting questions on these sessions as well, which I'll do my best to answer at the end. But I'm going to start right at what was almost the beginning for me. So I've lived in Bristol for sort of about 7 years now. Always had a kind of interest of sorts in this topic, but it was really sort of being in Bristol during the events of summer 2020 with the statue of Edward Colston that got me thinking more about this, and then kind of cross-referencing it with some of the conversations I was having with organisations. So it's really exciting to be doing this talk today with a local Bristol group, because I feel I'm often using this as the example anyway, and it's nice to speak to people that probably know the context a bit better. But to do a kind of really quick summary, Edward Colston was obviously a very high-profile philanthropist who's really shaped Bristol in many ways through his donations. You know, certainly up until recently, there were a vast array of streets, buildings, schools, pubs, etc., named after him, even a fruity bun as well. But Edward Colston was also a merchant, a Tory MP, and a prolific slave trader as a senior executive of the Royal African Company. So the statue of him in Bristol was sort of long controversial and contentious, and was opposed by a great many local people and campaigning groups in terms of wanting to have it taken down. Initially through legal means, that was opposed by lots of groups, including the Society of Merchant Venturers in Bristol, and it all came to the head in the summer of 2020, you know, at the height of that Black Lives Matter awakening in Bristol and the anti-racism protests taking place in the city centre. The statue was torn down, went for a brief dunking in the River Avon, and ended up in its resting place in Emshed Museum in the centre of the city. And because this sort of felt really relevant to my work, this was a photo I took myself kind of going down there in the immediate aftermath, and just sort of thinking what it meant from a fundraising and a philanthropy perspective, and hearing what other people were saying as well. So there was a really interesting tweet from Paul Ramsbottom, who's the CEO of the Wolfson Foundation, and he said, in UK society, it's no longer deemed acceptable to argue that philanthropy can cover the iniquities of how funds were first generated. The statue of Bristol's most famous philanthropist is a striking image of that, and that argument now lies with Colston at the bottom of the Avon, which I think is a sentiment lots of us can get behind and get on board with. But I think when I started thinking about all of the other problematic examples of philanthropy that are less black and white, I was kind of really starting to feel a bit uncomfortable that actually that argument is still very much a live thing, and actually there's plenty of other examples where philanthropy is being used to kind of excuse or cover up issues with the source of funding and problematic ethical issues as well. So Colston was a sort of real jumping off point for me, and I kind of wrote and published a couple of blogs in the immediate aftermath of this. But to link it in with another sort of high-profile, well-known example, and I'm just moving my camera view slightly so I can see the slide properly. Some of you will probably be familiar with the case of the Sackler Trust, a high-profile trust that has sponsored and donated millions of pounds over the years to high-profile cultural institutions in the UK and beyond. But the Sackler family and the trust made the bulk of their fortune from the US pharmaceutical company Purdue Pharma. And as it says on the screen, they were heavily implicated in the US opioid crisis, and it became a real kind of toxic association. Purdue Pharma not only manufactured a highly addictive opioid painkiller called OxyContin, which has caused addictions, which is known to have led to the death of over 500,000 Americans. But they also pursued aggressive legal action to kind of shut down complaints and growing evidence of the harm being caused and the addictive nature of OxyContin. A lot of that has been popularized in various documentaries, including a Netflix series called Dope Sick. But what's interesting is I think, a lot of this was rumbling on and partially known for several years. And yet the Sackler name was kind of all over the UK cultural landscape. It was only about 10 years ago that Teresa Sackler, one of the heads of the family, herself received a medal for arts philanthropy, kind of honouring her contribution that she'd made to the sector. And the screenshot on the bottom right is still up on the government website today, sort of naming her as someone that received that award. So, long after this association was known to be problematic, cultural institutions were continuing to take the money. In the wake of this really breaking in around 2019, 2020, I think it was, a number of those, including those shown on screen, British Museum, Tate Galleries, National Portrait Gallery, etc., kind of distanced themselves from the Sackler Trust and said they wouldn't be taking any more money. Others have got there now, but were much slower to do so. So the V&A Gallery and Kew Gardens in London. Again, this is a photo I took myself last year of a bridge that until really recently was still known as the Sackler Crossing. So, long after this was known to be a controversial issue, that name was still being displayed, and cultural institutions were sort of pushing back on concerns about taking money from Sackler and featuring that name on their bridges, buildings, spaces, etc. I should say, actually, most of the newspaper headlines and screenshots that you'll see on these slides, when we send them through afterwards, they're all clickable to the original articles if you want to read more as well. But the bottom one was a Financial Times investigation, which was only actually completed early this year, where they found out that even through all of this, even up until today, Oxford University has continued to kind of cultivate a relationship with the Sacklers, take money quietly, invite them to their events and things like that. Not actually the last reference to Oxford University I'll be making on these slides, interestingly. But so, a lot of these ties still exist somewhat today. And despite this well-known controversy, Sackler Trust has continued to be a funder to a lot of these organisations. So I think those are two of the most black and white examples of problematic philanthropy, and certainly the more higher profile ones that have been in the news recently. But I think if you start to scratch below the surface, there are so many kind of links and associations that we might want to consider whether they're problematic for our organisations if we recognise the issue with Colston and Sackler. So some of the greyer areas, many of you may be aware that the Tate Galleries take their name from the Tate and Lyle Sugar Company, which was actually founded long after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. But I think there's kind of various problematic associations linking back between Tate and Lyle and the slave trade. Certainly the whole sugar industry that led to the growth of a lot of these companies kind of grew directly out of the slave trade and wouldn't have been possible without them, to the extent that the Tate Galleries have published a long article on the website talking about the issues there and some of the problematic artifacts they have. But again, the name association kind of exists to this day, and those artifacts are often still in place. When I was researching this topic kind of in the wake of Colston in 2020, I was really interested to find a report by Ethical Consumer magazine, and I've included a link, a quote in the bottom corner here, to say that the UK's big 5 high street banks, so Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds, RBS and Santander, are hindering the sector's efforts to tackle climate change by continuing to profit from some of the world's dirtiest fossil fuel projects. The UK's mainstream banking industry has involvement with virtually every ethical problem sector, from factory farming through to nuclear weapons. And when I think about, firstly, looking at charities' ethical fundraising policies and seeing sort of blanket exclusions relating to things like nuclear weapons and that kind of thing, and then thinking about, particularly during COVID, the amount of funding that was made available either directly through the likes of Barclays or through a linked corporate foundation, Lloyds Bank Foundation, Santander Foundation, I think it's possible to start to see how it's really easy for us to create ethical fundraising policies that we think are something we can always stick to, but there will quickly be lots of these associations that just make you think, maybe we need to have a bit more of a sophisticated conversation about some of these topics. And the last example I'll give, it ended as a scheme very recently, but until I think it was early this year, lots of charities, particularly smaller ones that I work with on a day-to-day basis, took donations through the Amazon kind of give as you shop Amazon Smile scheme, despite lots of known issues with some of the kind of problem areas of Amazon as a business related to climate change, poor employment practices and that kind of thing. So again, there are things that we would see ourselves as sort of not being associated with, but lots of charities again potentially have a link there. And again, I'll kind of come back to Amazon in a few moments as well. So I think lots of kind of problematic grey areas that I think are just worth thinking about in terms of whether we develop policies in the way that we're instinctively thinking about. But if we kind of blow the conversation wider for a moment and look at philanthropy more generally, I think there probably is an issue with perceptions around, what is the reality of what philanthropy looks like today, and what are our perceptions about what it exists to do. So I've just included on screen a dictionary definition of philanthropy here, defined as goodwill to all to fellow members of the human race, and especially an active effort to promote human welfare, or an act or gift done or made for humanitarian purposes. And I think it's interesting to compare and contrast that to. So this was when I do these talks and share this on social media, I feel this is the statistic that kind of always gets the biggest reaction from people in terms of, wow, can that really be true? So a Guardian article about philanthropy in 2020 looked at where a total of £7 billion of donations made to charity by UK millionaires in the decade from 2007 to 2017, looking at kind of where they went to and what causes they supported. And out of £7 billion of money donated, more than 2/3 of that went exclusively to higher education institutions, of which half of that, so a third of the total, went exclusively to two universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And these circles are to scale. Only £222 million of that money donated actually went to causes associated with alleviating poverty. So I would argue, in terms of, when we think of the bigger picture of, okay, some of the sources of this funding is problematic, but it's going towards good causes, I think there's an uncomfortable argument that you have to look at around, well, how much of that money is actually kind of entrenching social differences and social inequality rather than resolving it. And this is something I think that academics are particularly picking up on when we think about it in the context of the gift aid scheme as well, because not only are these people donating their own money to a very particular niche set of causes, but they are essentially getting a percentage of that topped up with state funding, tax money, that is subsidizing those donations to actually very elite causes, and arguably, certain academics argue, taking that money away from other causes. So, actually, there's a growing argument, excuse me, that a lot of philanthropy is having a net negative impact on our attempt to kind of pursue social change and humanitarian causes. So bringing that together in terms of what is the emerging case against philanthropy, and I've just included a couple of screenshots of a couple of books I've read on this. I've made sure they're linked to places where you can buy them that definitely aren't Amazon, because someone asked me if that was the case recently, and I was glad it already was. So I read a book kind of actually just before all of the Colston stuff in 2020 by an author called Anand Giridharadas, called Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. And it is really about how kind of big corporates and, really high level philanthropists pick the causes they support and where they direct the money and the influence they get over things as a result. And it makes direct references to another book called Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, by an author called Rob Wright, that kind of picks up on similar themes, but looks more at the tax argument I was making in the previous slide. So how philanthropy kind of sucks up money and attention and directs it towards certain causes, and how that's sort of strikingly different to what many of us see as philanthropy. And I think that, the picture that undeniably pulls together is that most philanthropy isn't actually going towards causes that directly help people in need or make their world a better place. And I know we can't be as simple as saying, Oxford and Cambridge universities don't fall into that category, because some of that money will be used to create kind of student scholarships and bursaries and things like that as well. So it's not a black and white picture, but I think the distribution of where money is going is very different to what most of us expect. What philanthropy is undoubtedly doing is it's giving a privileged elite a disproportionate influence over social issues, both through what they choose directly to fund and not to fund, the roles they take on boards and advisory groups as a result of their donations, which help them to shape policy, and simply as thought leaders in terms of the causes they choose to focus on and the ways they choose to do things. And I've now had this conversation with a couple of kind of global health organizations that say, if you look at how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has just completely changed the World Health agenda in terms of how work is done and what countries it's focused on and what conditions and things like that are favoured, you start to see quickly how a very small number of people have gained a huge amount of influence through their philanthropy. And I think where this becomes a problem is, what does their version of social change really look like, right? So what if they have structured their businesses and their personal finances to pay as little tax as possible and are actually taking money away from the welfare state? What if their business activities massively contribute to things like climate change and their employment policies keep people trapped in poverty? And what if their philanthropy is being used in a way that kind of excuses or distracts from those activities, or allows them to pursue their own agenda through the seats at the table they're getting and the way they're able to kind of shape and influence causes? And certainly this is the growing kind of academic case that more people are making, and, posing that uncomfortable question of, to what extent are our organizations complicit in that by giving kind of focus to these people through the donations we choose to accept or reject. And I thought it'd be interesting to show how this can play out in reality by giving a couple of examples of contentious donations that have actually come up in the last year or so. So firstly, some of you might be familiar with a feminist fund. I think they're US based, called Frida. And in March 2022, they chose to consider and then accept an enormous $10 million donation from Mackenzie Scott, who is a former Amazon executive and former wife of Jeff Bezos as well. And they took a really interesting approach to this that I think was widely kind of praised on social media at the time. So they did ultimately choose to accept the donation, but boy, did they not hold back from talking about how problematic it was. And they framed it all around essentially money that had been taken away from the communities that they supported, that they were giving back. So they said, while we're humbled and excited to receive this donation and map out the ways it could strengthen Frida's community and strategy, we acknowledge the source of Mackenzie Scott's wealth and its association with one of the most exploitative companies in the world. And they talked about the kind of huge profits that Amazon had made in the last financial quarter, that they were profiting off alarming and dangerous practices that violate human rights, perpetuate inequity worldwide, and harm our planet, including extreme tax avoidance, poor working conditions in factories, slave labor in their supply chain, and catastrophic environmental impact. So they really kind of they made absolutely sure that accepting this donation did not put them in a position where they were seen to be complicit or excusing the things that Amazon does. Now, I would argue it's a lot easier to do this when you're dealing with a donation from someone that used to be part of Amazon and used to be married to Jeff Bezos, rather than that connection still being there. But I think it does show a kind of different way to consider donations. And it probably hints at, when you're developing your ethical fundraising policy, a crucial question to consider is, in accepting these donations, would we feel tied either contractually or morally or, in an implied way to not talking openly about the impact that type of money has on our communities? And I think, Frida played this balance extremely carefully and were widely praised as a result of it. And pretty much in the same month this was happening, there was a really interesting example close to home as well, where Save the Children were offered a $1 million donation towards their relief work in Ukraine from the North Sea oil company Neptune Energy. And after thinking about it carefully, they chose to reject that donation because of its kind of problematic association with climate change. So they said, as an organization, we're committed to working on climate change issues for the foreseeable future, and therefore we can't take money from an oil company. And one of the places, perhaps unsurprisingly, this was criticised in was an article in the Telegraph, where they featured kind of quotes from a letter that Neptune Energy sent back to Save the Children's trustees, really questioning that decision, saying it had left their workers feeling shocked, dismayed, and wondering whether their personal donations would be welcomed by Save the Children, which I think is a sort of slightly interesting and underhand way to tackle it. But they really called the charity out and said, you shouldn't decline donations that make a material difference to your stated aim to give every child a better future. So they kind of linked it back to the charity's mission and vision and said, well, how central is climate change to that? And should you be rejecting a donation because of its impact on climate change, when doing so will have such a negative impact on your work? And this was kind of really sensitive and topical at the time because it was right when the Ukraine war was starting. So, that $1 million could have made a big difference. And, this was a decision Save the Children made. But I think it kind of shows that, even if you make a decision that you think is for the right reasons, that doesn't mean you're going to be immune to the criticism that comes from it. So bringing this all together, I promise I'm going to come on in a second to talk about some of the things we can do about it, because I know it's presenting a bit of a tricky situation. But to kind of summarize, what is the dilemma for your organization and your leadership? Firstly, you want to think about, what criteria do we actually apply to our decision as to whether we accept or reject a donation? Do we think that broader issues related to things like climate change, tax avoidance, do we feel that they're relevant depending on the nature of our work? How do we balance that question of pragmatism and ethics? So, we want to make the right decisions and be ethical, but also if we reject a donation, that can lead to harm to service users, closure of services, staff redundancies potentially as well. So that's a really difficult balance. And, we can quickly get really philosophical about this, but do we generally see philanthropy at its core as something that's about distracting from problematic issues? Or can we take the route that Frida did and frame it around reparation? This company giving this money, or this person giving their money, is making a very deliberate attempt to make up for past wrongs. And, do we see that as an argument that we're willing to accept? And when we make these decisions, how do we justify them? How do we prepare for some of the backlash we're going to have? And I've just added a final question to think about, which is particularly for your trustees, or if you're a trustee yourself, how do you balance the different legal obligations you have as a charity trustee? So some of you might be familiar with the Charity Commission's CC3 document. They've got a governance jigsaw, they call it, that lays out 6 broad areas of responsibility as a trustee. One of those is you have to manage your charity's resources responsibly. And the first 2 bullet points in that section are, on the one hand, you've got to make sure your charity is getting the resources you need. So that potentially suggests you'd be in a questionable territory if you were rejecting a vitally important donation for the wrong reasons. But also you have to manage your charity's assets, and they include reputation in the assets. So you've got this almost impossible job of, on the one hand, we've got to make sure we accept money and don't reject it for spurious reasons, but we've also got to make sure we protect our reputation and the people we support as well. So, big question. What can you do about all of this? Well, firstly, I'm going to be very clear on the things I'm not suggesting you do. So I am not suggesting that you reject any donation that carries any form of risk or ethical complication out of hand, because I think you would quickly get yourself into a position where you shut off far more avenues than you realized. I think it's really, really important as you go through this process, you don't make decisions that are either based on the sum total of the personal beliefs of the people in the room. So, what do our trustees personally think about pornography or alcohol or things like that? You want to be really careful you're not just reacting to something a different organization has done, or something that's happened recently in the media and the response to that. And you don't just want to be reacting to the loudest voices, whether that's your supporters, your donors, again, the headlines you'll see in the Daily Mail or the Guardian or wherever it happens to be, because those aren't things that are necessarily directly relevant to your organization, and they're very temporary as well, and they're not the right criteria for making decisions. And finally, don't make decisions kind of quickly that you haven't fully considered in terms of trying to map out, well, if we do this, what will people say and how will we respond to it and how will we feel comfortable about it? Because as I said at the beginning, the risk there is you kind of accept a donation, then row back on it, and you leave yourself with neither the money nor the credit as a result. So it's really important to kind of think these decisions through carefully before you put them into practice. So the way I think you need to develop an ethical fundraising policy is really try and focus in on the types of donation and the types of wider action that would do things like perpetuate or excuse or distract from the social issues that your organisation exists to solve. That could be seen as some way as compromising your own mission or your own values, or causing harm to the people you serve or the people you support. And a crucial one that I guess kind of cuts across all of those areas is would a certain type of fundraising, would a certain type of donation prevent you from then being able to say or do what is right for your organization or your service users? So this is one I've seen come up quite a lot with museums, for example, when they're considering whether to accept or display a certain artifact. You know, they will often have that debate around, well, in the material around that exhibit, can we put information up that acknowledges, you know, the contentious source of this or the problematic ethical issue that it touches on? And if we're being placed in a position where by kind of accepting money or accepting an artifact, we can't do that, then that's possibly going to be a red line for us in terms of whether we're willing to accept it or not. So in terms of how you develop an ethical fundraising policy or a gift acceptance policy, that kind of does these things, I think what you absolutely can't do is just go and find another organization's template policy that you might be able to borrow from a colleague or find on the web somewhere and kind of quickly adapt it, because I think this is where I've seen it happen again and again with organizations where they say, you know, we won't accept any money that comes from the proceeds of gambling. And you're like, well, what about National Lottery Community Fund? You know, you really need to think through these decisions. You need to be clear what some of the implications are. So you're going to have to roll your sleeves up, and your management team and trustees and fundraisers are going to have to really have some of these difficult conversations around which issues relate directly to our cause, what's particularly problematic. And then you're going to have to really try and contextualize it based on your own type of fundraising. So, you know, you want to think about what suppliers are you working with, and how much you need to consider their conduct and things like that. You know, other third parties you're involved with, types of fundraising that you're doing, types of donation that you're particularly likely to receive. So, you know, if you're a rare disease charity, you're probably going to have an opportunity at some point before very long to be offered money from a pharmaceutical company. So really try and think about, you know, which elements of what I've talked about today apply to our organization. And as you start to develop those decisions, test them with some hypothetical scenarios as well. So this is a set of questions I've used in the past when I'm doing a kind of in-house ethical fundraising policy with an organization. Let's say you choose to accept a contentious donation. How are you going to respond if someone says, well, accepting their money is immoral, or I'm going to withdraw my own support because I'm not willing to support an organization that takes money from this type of industry or sector? And how are you going to respond to an accusation that by accepting this donation, you know, you're condoning, you're excusing, you're whitewashing a particular social issue? But, you know, the challenges don't end when you accept a donation. So if you reject it, you may well hear things like, you care more about your reputation than your mission and the people you serve. Issues like climate change and tax avoidance and problematic labour practices don't have anything directly to do with your work, so why would they be relevant? And that's probably one you can quickly start to build up an argument about by showing how some of those issues do have an indirect impact on the people you support. You may be accused of just playing politics or caving to pressure, or being woke is the one we hear again and again these days. And people might try and link it back to your mission and the people you support. So say, you know, I get the ethical considerations, but hey, this was a big donation, and rejecting it is actually putting people at risk and staff at risk and preventing you from doing important work. So I know it's really difficult to arrive at kind of definitive answers to all of these questions, but I think if you can at least think about them and think about how would we justify our decision and how would we explain it if we had some of these objections, you'll develop a policy that's both more robust and well thought out in general. But if you hit issues recently, you know, if you hit issues suddenly, if you appear in the media, or your biggest donor or the chair of your board or whoever it is really takes an issue, then you've kind of got a ready-made response for how you might deal with that. And as I said at the start, a kind of high-level ethical fundraising policy is great, but it's really easy for it just to sit in a drawer somewhere and not feel relevant to your day-to-day work. So there's a couple of things that you really need to do to kind of underpin and enforce it and make it relevant. So firstly, you need to then have that due diligence process that actually says, when we're approaching high net worth individuals and high-level prospects, what do we do? Is there a particular process we follow to check the source of their funding and check if they've appeared in media articles and that kind of thing? What's our assessment and decision-making processes then for those bigger donations? So, I've worked with lots of organizations that have a red, amber, green system where they will flag something as either absolutely fine, absolutely a no-go, or a middle ground that maybe needs more careful consideration. And they will often say, okay, if we flag it as amber, that's going to have to go to a specific group of people that debate it in a bit more detail and are responsible for making that decision. And I was doing this exact exercise with an organization kind of trying to set up these processes last year. And they had a really interesting and encouraging discussion as a board of trustees where they said, well, yeah, it's probably going to be our ultimate decision to make this decision, but we know at the moment that we're not representative enough of our wider service users and people like that to feel we have the whole picture. So what they tried to do is pull together a panel of people where they said, if a donation is particularly problematic, it won't just be the board, but we will canvass a group of our service users and a group of our frontline staff to get their opinions on it as well, which I just think is such a good way to do it, because you're inevitably going to expose yourself to different views and considerations that maybe as a management team or a board, you haven't considered yourselves. And there's various other things you can then do to kind of turn this into practice. So something we've started doing with our prospect research that my team do with a lot of the charities we work with is just add a column to our research to say, what is the source of that funding? This corporate foundation, what does the corporate that donates money to them actually do? Is it a bank? Is it an alcohol company? And just to start to flag up those things so it's really clear for people to consider them. So you almost can't consider a prospect without considering those things. I've seen organizations develop really clear ethical checklists for third-party suppliers. So before they start working with anyone on any sort of fundraising arrangement, they will have a list of questions to work through because they feel they're only as good as their suppliers in terms of, ethical practice. And then I think there's an area to this that goes beyond processes, which is about kind of wider culture as well, and actually empowering the people that do your fundraising on a day-to-day basis. So firstly, making sure they kind of input into your policy and they understand the decisions that you've made. Secondly, really important to make sure there's some sort of process there for complaints or concerns, because I've seen it again and again where more junior fundraisers often feel they just can't challenge a decision, or they've got nobody they can approach. They're not going to go to the CEO or the board and say, hold on a minute, we need to think about this further. So does there need to be a discrete process for doing that? Does that need to be anonymous? How do we make sure people feel comfortable voicing concerns? And just target setting in general with fundraising. I've heard fundraisers say again and again, well, I'm working to such a tough target in the current climate with my organization trying to sustain its work that I do feel this donation is a bit questionable. But if we reject it, it's just going to have such an impact on my own job and perceptions of my own performance that I feel I've got to kind of sit on those concerns. So you need to be aware how your kind of targets and performance management process sort of affects people's willingness to raise issues as well. And then finally, I think this is an interesting one, because I feel when I talk about these things, lots of people agree with me up to a certain point, and then often they'll be like, oh, hold on a sec, we're not willing to do this. But I think those of you that have worked in fundraising for a long time probably familiar with the concept of kind of relationship fundraising and donor love, and this idea that to fundraise well, we always need to kind of put the donor first and make sure they feel special and valued and that kind of thing. And I've heard it again and again from fundraisers saying, well, that actually causes a clash with our ability to kind of challenge donors and say to them, hold on a second, we need to ask you about this area and we need to make sure you're happy with us talking about these problematic issues. And, all of these things combined. So, target setting, the concept of always loving and respecting your donors sort of all comes together to make people feel uncomfortable about things. And so you may have an ethical fundraising policy sitting there somewhere written down, but if you don't have the culture to go with it, it's going to be really hard to empower people to actually follow it. And when I first wrote a blog about this in summer 2020, some of you might recognise the name here, because Hannah actually used to run the Bristol fundraising group, and we got into a good chat about it on Twitter. And you know, she reflected on this is in the immediate aftermath to things happening with Colston, and saying, you know, I know I've been part of the problem essentially at events in Bristol where local philanthropists have talked about not being in support of renaming and removing Colston from the city, and me feeling that I'm at risk of kind of harming the relationship for the organisation I represent by having an opinion. And she said, you know, too much emphasis is put on individual people in fundraising to make ethical decisions, and that's always going to be a point of contention where the organisation doesn't have a policy, or you know, isn't supporting people in the ways I've suggested to actually put it into action. So I think it's really, really worth thinking about, you know, yes, we have a policy, but who's doing our fundraising? How do they compare in power and status and confidence to our donors and our board? And are we creating the right dynamics where those people who probably know most of all in terms of the difficulties with a donor or a source of funding, do they feel comfortable to actually kind of bring some of these challenges to the fore as well? So I'm pretty much there. I think we'll throw it open to questions in a moment, but just by way of a quick recap, you know, if this has started you thinking about it being a really interesting topic you want to think about more, I've put links to the two books I've already mentioned, and another one which is sitting on my bookshelf that I'm desperately keen to read as soon as possible. Excuse me, called Decolonizing Wealth by an author called Edgar Villanueva. And again, all of the images of books are linked through to somewhere you can buy them. I've mentioned the First Guardian article. It's always the Guardian that writes about this sort of stuff in detail. So they've got a really good article around, you know, the case for how philanthropy benefits the super rich, and another one around the trouble with charitable billionaires that are well worth a read. And finally, you know, we've published our own series of blogs on this dating back to summer 2020. So initially in the kind of days and weeks following the statue of Edward Colston coming down, just sort of mapping out that argument I've made today around how, you know, unlike maybe what the CEO of the Wolfson Foundation said, this isn't the end of an argument and a discussion, but it actually really needs to be the beginning, because there's so much more problematic or hypocritical philanthropy out there. We were then asked to do a follow-up piece saying, you know, this is all great, but how do we actually change and challenge problematic philanthropy? So we kind of took up the challenge of doing that. And then actually only early this year, we brought that all together into a bit more of a hands-on guide on how to actually go through the process of creating an ethical fundraising policy as well. So all of these links will be clickable when you get the slides afterwards. You know, do have a look through some of these articles and blogs as well. And just as a really quick reminder, you know, we work across the areas you can be on screen as well. So we have a wider team of people involved in doing bid writing for organisations. I do a lot of our kind of fundraising strategy development work and facilitation of business planning exercises as well. And we do run kind of in-house ethical fundraising workshops with organisations that are kind of a mix of some of the theoretical stuff in this presentation, but then the practical side of how do we make those decisions contextualised for our organisation as well. Excuse me, I'm running out of voice at this point. So yeah, do feel free to get in touch with that. I am actually going on holiday in a couple of days for a couple of weeks. So, you know, do get in touch and ask any questions you want. Connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Happy to kind of take the conversation further. Apologies if I don't reply to that immediately, if that comes in over the next couple of weeks. But hopefully that's given you a lot to think about. And yeah, I'll hand back over to Sophie and Emma now, and we can start discussing some feedback and questions.
Thank you ever so much, Mike. That was really interesting. I've already got lots of questions. I'm sure lots of other people do in the room too. What I think was really interesting is how quite often at Bristol Fundraising Group, we have to make decisions about who we get to come and talk and different kind of topics. And it doesn't always cover absolutely everybody. And I think everything that you've talked about today, whatever fundraising you are involved in, maybe you might not have thought if you were a community and events fundraiser, but it touches for absolutely everybody the considerations that we need to have as an organisation about where our income's coming from. So thank you. I also feel like you've opened a massive can of worms, and a lot of us are going to go away and start to be a bit anxious about our ethical fundraising policies and gift acceptance policies and so forth. But yeah, thank you. And what I'm going to do really quickly is, I'm really aware that we've allocated a bit more time for this session in case there are lots of questions. So I think I might just say a couple of things to finish off now in case people need to leave at 11, and then we'll carry on if that's okay. So Mike, massive thank you for joining us today. Please remember everybody that we will send out a little survey via email that you can just fill in to feedback about this session, and also when people give us an example of people they might like to hear from or topics that they would like us to discuss, this often helps us to shape future sessions. Our next Bristol Fundraising Group meeting is in person in June. So that's Tuesday the 27th of June, and it's being held in central Bristol at the new Sparks, the Bristol Global Goals Centre. This session is going to be looking at fundraising for the new. So whether or not you are a new startup or organisation, or a really experienced charity, but you've got a new project, or possibly a new fundraiser, then we're going to cover some of those questions, and it'll also be a networking event. I can see that Alex, who's one of our other committee members, has got a hand up, so I'm going to pass over to Alex quickly.
Oh no, sorry, this is just for a question for Mike, so please carry on.
Alex is organising the event next month, so I thought maybe Alex wanted to add to that. So, okay, thanks ever so much, everyone. Please do stick around for questions, but we understand if you need to dash off. Have I said everything? Oh, and this session will be up on our Vimeo channel later on as well, so you can watch back. So I think we will go straight over to Alex with her question.
Thanks, Sophie. Thank you, Mike. That was so interesting. I really enjoyed the session. The question that I had was around individual givers and looking at, say, funders or organisations who are interested in donating. It can be a lot easier to look at their background and look at their history to see if it kind of ethically matches with your charity. In terms of individual givers, are there any tips that you would put forward in terms of how to make it easier to kind of look into their background at all?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's I've worked with a couple of larger organisations on this, and I would have to go away and check the details. But I think there is, you know, if this is a live enough issue for you, there is software you can get that does sort of past media and internet analysis, so you can kind of run people's names through it, and it will link to kind of where they've been in the media and articles and things like that. So I think if you know, if this is important enough to you that it needs to be an ongoing resource, then that's something to consider. But I don't think beyond that there's really any hard and fast ways to do it. I think it's just, you know, being curious, doing some really good searches, being prepared to go down a few rabbit holes, and, you know, think laterally in terms of when their name comes up in association with companies and panels and things like that, of just sort of checking the details of those people as well. And I would also just say, like, I think something I've heard again and again from fundraisers is the importance of having a process and doing that early, because I think something, you know, those of us on the call today who are kind of corporate or major donors in particular will know that kind of donor cultivation process can easily be 12 months plus in terms of, you know, from when you first identify a prospect to starting to engage them, getting to the point where you solicit a gift. And the problem I've seen people come to is, you know, then they take it to the board, they're expecting it to be rubber stamped, and then those people are suddenly raising kind of ethical issues at that point. And that fundraiser is sitting there saying, well, you know, it's been 10 meetings and hours and days of work over the last year or so, and that's potentially straight in the bin. So what I would say is, you know, do it at your research stage, and you know, whether that's on a database or a spreadsheet, depending on the size of your organization and your resources. As I say, you know, have a box, have a column for these ethical issues, and start to jot down these things, and, you know, be able to say at a very early stage, this donor looks great, they love our work, but they are a shareholder in this company that does this problematic thing, and kind of have that front and center as early as possible, because you don't want to just be making decisions at the point of once the donation's offered. You really need to be thinking about, do we chase them as a prospect? Firstly, because it can result in a lot of wasted time, but secondly, it can result in embarrassment as well. And I've seen this with fundraisers in the past, where they've sat down with a donor at 5 meetings, they've got them to offer a gift, and then they have to go back and they say, oh, actually we're not going to be able to accept that. And the donor quite rightly is like, well, why have we spent the last 6 months talking about it and planning it out if that's not something you're willing to consider? So I think, doing that research methodically and early is really important.
Thanks, Mike. We've got a question in the chat from Julie. Julie says, Mike, most of us do the work we do because we want to make a difference and want charities to thrive. How do we and you not get cynical about philanthropical efforts and investments further to the issues that you've raised?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it is really easy to be cynical about it and kind of scathing, I guess, because of the mindset and mentality of a lot of us that work in the sector. And I think that's where I would just, firstly, keep linking it back to mission, service users, values, things like that, and say, we know that there's possibly some things that have happened in the past, and we know that this donor might not be coming into it with the purest of intentions, but is that directly relevant for our organization? Does it matter to us that their business might have been involved in certain elements of things that maybe we don't approve of personally, but it's not so relevant to our cause? And I think, there is a nature. It's a really difficult one, because I think, a lot has happened over the last few years that is making philanthropists and companies kind of wake up and actually want to explore these issues. And I think it's also important that we don't just kind of shut that down and attack that straight away, because people kind of begin their own journey in different places. And if you automatically say, no, we're completely cynical, you're going to be doing it for the wrong reasons, you kind of just entrench people further in their positions where they feel, a company might be starting to take action on an issue and wanting to donate money and kind of respond to something, but maybe because they haven't got it quite right yet, because it's not very developed, you just sort of slap them down and kind of push them further back into a hole. So I think it's important to kind of think of that being a journey and a process for companies and philanthropists as well. And I think the important thing is just to feel you can talk to them about it. Maybe do say, I came back from that meeting and I discussed it with a couple of our frontline workers and our service users and our trustees, and here are a couple of things they were nervous about, and I wonder if we could talk to them a bit more. And I think if you do that, yes, you're probably going to lose yourself some donation opportunities potentially as a result, but you're probably also going to understand people's motivations a bit more, because if they instantly just back away from that and are angry that it's even been mentioned, you can probably be pretty sure that they're cynical and they're doing it for the wrong reasons. But if they're willing to kind of have that conversation and explain their motivations, that's probably the way to get to the bottom of it. Like I say, that's probably not the quickest and easy way to fundraise, and I guess that's why these are the important conversations to have to kind of set the approach and the policy for your organization. But I think explore it with donors, and also see it as something where they're probably at a different starting point to you, and that they might get further along that path over time as well.
Thank you, Mike. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put your hand up or pop it into the chat. Caroline made a good comment earlier, saying be very interested to find out more about how the negotiations went between Frida and Mackenzie Scott. And I was thinking as well, that she might not have been very happy to have had all that negative kind of publicity about that. And I was kind of thinking on the other side, because I don't know much about the relationship, whether or not it was, if she was already ex-wife and ex-linked to Amazon, whether this move was quite strategic in that the negativity was being taken away from her and it was to somebody that she maybe wasn't getting on with so well anymore. I don't know if you know any more about that, Mike, that you can share.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I don't know the story inside out, and I'm sure there will have been things that were discussed behind the scenes that kind of never made it into the public eye. But my understanding is what probably made it easier for Frida is that she was an outspoken critic, and she's been quite an outspoken philanthropist, and has kind of, I think, wanted to distance herself from Amazon and certain types of philanthropy, and is actually giving away quite a large portion of her wealth kind of in recognition of concern or guilt in terms of the way it was generated. So there was probably at least something there as a starting point. You know, I don't know to what extent that end statement from Frida is the version they would have wanted to put out, or if there were kind of, whether that was a bit of a negotiation process and sort of who was pushing who to make that exact statement. But yeah, I think it's probably a lot harder to do that type of thing if you don't have a donor that is at least on that process of starting to distance themselves from things and want to make amends. So my sense was it wouldn't have come as a surprise from Mackenzie Scott at all, but it was, you know, still a brave thing to do, and it probably still would have been, you know, if I think back to the last question and potentially starting some of these difficult conversations, I think sometimes you only get to understand whether a donor is willing to say and do these things if you challenge them a little bit and probe them a little bit. So I think, you know, there was an element of bravery in their approach in terms of clearly having done that, and also secondly being so strong with that statement. I mean, it really was a sort of really strident way of phrasing it, and would have also opened them up to criticism in different ways. So I think you know, there's a lot to be applauded there.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a question in the chat from Martha. Obviously bringing this quite, you know, local back to Bristol. Do you have any further thoughts about charitable grants from the Society of Merchant Venturers? Anybody that has accepted a grant from them in the past knows that they do like to publicise their grants. So yeah, be interested to hear your thoughts on that, Mike.
Yeah, and I think in the last few years, momentum has sort of really built on questioning their donations a lot more, because there is, you know, a very strong and clear tie to slavery. And I think, you know, that's one thing. But I think the Society of Merchant Venturers were also one of the, as I understand it, you know, the strongest critics and opponents of taking down the statue of Edward Colston as well. And when there were attempts in Bristol to put a kind of plaque on it that said, you know, here's what Edward Colston did for the city of Bristol, but also all of the negative associations and his kind of heavy involvement in slavery, the Society of Merchant Venturers were one of the lead voices in kind of trying to dilute that statement and change the wording of it and shift the emphasis much more back onto look at all the great impact of his philanthropy rather than look at his involvement in the slave trade. So I would tread extremely carefully with the Society of Merchant Venturers, and you could probably in 10 minutes do lots of Googling. You know, there are various things on their website where they set out their position, but there are also a lot of articles from recent times around, you know, what they've been involved with and what they've said and done and things like that. So you could quickly kind of gather your own profile on that. But I think you know, it's clearly problematic. And when I did one of these talks a while ago, someone said to me, well, the trouble is, you know, particularly working in Bristol, wherever there's any of those enormous sources of wealth, sadly, you know, it often leads back to very quickly some sort of problematic practice, or quite quickly to things like the slave trade, because of the nature of Bristol as a city. But I think there clearly are layers to that, in terms of it's one thing to have derived income originally from the slave trade, and it's another thing to have kind of held on to that strident view of opposition for so long. So yeah, I would certainly do some searching and consider whether you and your organization are comfortable with some of the things they've said and done. But equally, I know that I'm not here to kind of tell any organization how to do their own fundraising or what to put in their own policy as well.
Thanks, Mike. And James has got a question, so over to you, James.
Hi, Mike, it's fascinating. Just finding this so interesting. Thank you for this. Just thinking about, you talked a bit about the UK banks. I'm just thinking about the supermarkets who are quite, you know, they have big community fundraising campaigns, and thinking about sort of dividing your personal ethical and political opinions from the kind of the nature of giving. Taking Tesco's for an example, you know, I'm not a great fan of the way Tesco's go about developing their business, and you know, they can be quite ruthless, particularly in their kind of accessing greenfield sites and stuff like that. We accepted a small grant, which was a customer vote. And I think that's quite a sort of clever way that Tesco's actually do their giving, is to get their customers in local stores to vote for the charity that they want to give to. Don't know if you've just got any feelings about that, whether you've got any other examples of you know, sort of big supermarkets and ethical concerns around that.
Yeah, that's such a difficult part of all of this, which you know, I've discussed this on sessions in the past, where there's also this question of where do we draw the line between the problem being philanthropy and the problem just being capitalism, and you know, to what extent do we? So many of these businesses will be involved in so many things, as you say, we're personally uncomfortable with. I mean, I'd say two things, and apologies on the first one, it's a bit of a repeat, but you know, keep trying to center it back on our service users and our mission and the issue we exist to solve. And you know, it might be, if your work has some relevance to, you know, greenfield sites or people that are affected by that practice in particular, it's more of a live issue. And I guess the second thing I try and do, and this is with regard to what I said about kind of justifying and standing behind decisions, is almost going through that thought process of saying, okay, so this is the issue we have with Tesco. If that's an issue for us, who else would that drag into the mix? You know, what other big companies and household names and linked corporate foundations would we also have an issue with? And how quickly do we start to take so much of the potential donor market and corporate market out of there that we need to, I guess, balance it back up with that issue of pragmatism, which, you know, ultimately, I guess it comes down to, do we think more harm is done by supporting Tesco, and are they sort of using that money to really excuse and distract from practices, versus if we don't accept that money and we can't get it from another source, what impact does that have on our work? So it's a really hard one. I mean, I don't think, I also think with an ethical fundraising policy and a gift acceptance policy, if you've made decisions that you're all sitting there in a room feeling really comfortable and happy about, you've probably overlooked something or not thought about it from enough angles as well. So this isn't meant to be a comfortable process, and you're probably not going to get to the end of it with everyone sitting there going, yeah, I completely agree with this. But I think if you keep it focused on kind of, you know, mission, service users, values, hopefully people at least can understand some of these decisions they've made, even if you don't agree with them personally. But yeah, don't necessarily expect that everyone will feel completely comfortable with those, but there will definitely be, you know, donations and grants we accept, we don't feel entirely comfortable about, but we feel, you know, balanced against the bigger issue that they're okay for us, and they do more net good than harm. So hopefully that's a helpful answer to an extent.
Great question. Thanks, James, and thanks, Mike. Emma, you're next.
Yeah, well, it's really more of a kind of reflection on previous experience, as we were talking about earlier, about the relationship between a corporate donation and employee fundraising. In a previous job, it was a health charity, so we were very clear that we didn't accept any money from the tobacco industry. We, to be fair, never got any offers from any alcohol distributors. So, but we were then invited to be Charity of the Year for an arms manufacturer, one of the big defence industries up in Filton, and that did trigger exactly these sorts of conversations that we've just been talking about. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that because it was the employee fundraising, then we would be prepared to accept it. Not least of which because the kind of cause that we were trying to promote it's a health condition that's incredibly common, and you know, the likelihood is that, you know, and that there would be a proportion of people within any kind of community that would suffer from that condition, and therefore we were kind of balancing our promotional kind of mission against the idea, you know, the sort of slightly more kind of problematic ethical considerations of the defence industry. So but it certainly did prompt that conversation, which hadn't been particularly one that I think we'd even considered before, even in the long history of the organisation that that we'd had. I mean, I think it was about sort of 30 years old at that point.
Yeah, and I think employee fundraising is a bit different. I mean, it's easy to say the motivation for doing it comes from a very different place and a very different purpose to the company. That might be complicated by how much the company is going to shout about it afterwards and use it as a kind of tick in the box for their CSR. And maybe what I'm about to say depends on kind of the size of the company and the level of which employees are fundraising. But I also think, there's an extent to which lots of us middle class people have a bit more, lots of people have the skills and the experience to be able to choose where they work and be able to make positive decisions about I won't work for a company whose views I don't agree with. But there's an awful lot of people that don't have that luxury, and I think you've got to be careful you don't tar them with the brush of their company and assume that they work there because they kind of represent the values of that organization as well. And I would find it difficult if I thought about a charity saying to employees at a company, we're not going to accept your support because we question your morals and ethics, where those things might not have in any way come into their decision about working there potentially. So I think there's something there to think about as well. And also, as I say, how involved is the company in that process? Are they trying to profit through PR and things like that from those employee donations, or is it something that's kind of happening on their site but not being driven by them at all? So there's a few kind of additional considerations there maybe. Yeah,
and in some cases you have a company that supports its employees doing fundraising, but then will give a match donation, and that further complicates the picture. I'm not suggesting I have any answers either.
Yeah, it does complicate it, but I guess I would say at least if it's employee driven, the company is putting the money there but isn't necessarily deciding where it goes, so there's much less of a chance that they're intentionally kind of whitewashing things, and because they're not necessarily they're making the money available but they're not dictating what type of causes it goes to, which immediately I guess puts a layer of distance in there that makes it something that might be more palatable.
Yeah,
thanks Mike, that's really interesting. Yeah, lots of things to think about from that, and I hadn't thought about the us having the luxury to choose where we work sometimes. And you're right on that match funding side of things. We've probably lots of people have been in the situation where you've gone for some funding and it has been kind of the employee's choice to who gets the funding. So if that corporate then decides to further enhance that funding, is it the employees or is it the employer? So yeah, really interesting. Caroline, thank you. You're next with your question.
Hi, thanks. It was just sort of continuing. I was just so interested by that the Frida example, and I just wonder if, Mike, you've seen any examples that are slightly like smaller scale examples, either in terms of profile or donation amount, because that would be so ideal to be able to accept a donation but put out a public statement being like, we don't agree with the things they do. But I assume, there aren't many examples of that happening on the sort of smaller scale.
I certainly can't. I mean, I'm sure I must have seen them. I can't think of any off the top of my head that I can point you towards. I mean, I think an interesting thing unfolds all of the time, as I said earlier, with museums. Like, I think clearly there is a, excuse me, and I've actually done this type of ethical fundraising workshop with a museum in the past where they were talking about exactly this. And, we get offers of artifacts and things that are lent to us where it is strictly on, the grounds that you display it and you say we're wonderful and you don't mention anything else. And then others where they're happy to display a bit of information, but they'll put some strict limits on it. And others where maybe they actually kind of quite want to start that conversation. And, we're seeing this more and more with like the Tate galleries where they put that statement on their website themselves, sort of doing a bit of a Q&A and a bit of a dive into, well, actually, we're not directly related to the slave trade, but here are all of the things that are a bit uncomfortable. So I think it probably plays out in public more sometimes with museums, because you often these days go to exhibits and do see notes and things like that. So I think that's probably, albeit in a different setting, that sort of slightly more subtle example of how people push back a little bit, or at least acknowledge the source of wealth. If I think of any more examples, I'll put them on our Twitter and share them afterwards. But I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Thanks, Mike. I was just having a little think back to question about Society of Merchant Venturers and how they very much like the publicity that's associated with their giving. and you'll often be asked to form part of a kind of blog post for them, and yeah. Whereas the likes of Imperial Tobacco, another Bristol-based organisation, very much want to give completely anonymously, do not want it to be announced or mentioned. Where does that feed into when you're looking at the kind of ethics involved in accepting gifts? If an organisation clearly doesn't want to gain any marketing benefit, aware and anything from it, how does that feed into not whether or not you should accept the gift, but the kind of what behind the gift, the reason for that giving? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. It does. It's a tricky one because I think my immediate thought is, well, if they're not trying to generate publicity from it, they certainly can't be accused of doing the kind of distraction technique and whitewashing technique. So that's probably a positive. I think the flip side of that is, you know, there are companies that give anonymously because they know that any donation they do give is going to generate a huge amount of noise and controversy, and they just don't want to be involved with it, and they don't want to start a debate. So there can also be that negative element of, you know, why are they trying to give to scrutiny and what are they trying to avoid talking about? And, you know, maybe they're still getting the tax benefits from making their donations. They might not be getting the PR benefits, but they're getting all of the tax benefits and the other associated benefits, you know, maybe with their employees and things like that. But then they're trying to duck a conversation. So that's probably a positive and a negative. And, you know, it might again be a question for a funder or a donor to say out of curiosity, you know, why do you give anonymously? Not that we're not going to respect it, but we're curious as to the motives for that, and that might expose a bit more of the thinking. But I think there can be kind of positive and negative reasons for it.
Thanks, Mike. Has anybody else got any questions? John has just popped in the chat a link to an interesting exhibition that the Bank of England currently has on, which I will certainly have a look at after this call. We're coming up to 15:15, and we said we would finish at 11:15. So unless there are any last minute questions coming in, I just want to say a massive thank you again to Mike for joining us today. I found it really interesting, as I'm sure lots of other people have too. So yeah, thank you, and hopefully see you all in person next month.